It often starts quietly, a subtle frustration that bubbles up during yet another meeting where nothing really changes, or a moment at your desk when you wonder why the work you're doing doesn't feel as meaningful as it should. Perhaps it's the nagging thought that you could do more, be more, if only someone would give you permission. In Spark, Angie Morgan, Courtney Lynch, and Sean Lynch don't just argue that you can lead right where you are. They show, gently and persistently, that waiting for someone to hand you a title or authority isn't just unnecessary. It's exactly the mindset that keeps your potential dormant. Reading this book feels like sitting across from three candid, experienced friends who've seen the messy reality of teams, ambition, and fear, and who want to show you that leadership isn't bestowed from above. It's ignited from within. From the opening pages, there's something comforting in the author's refusal to play guru. Instead, they tell stories, drawn from their own lives and the lives of the countless professionals they've worked with, that feel recognizable even if you've never stepped into a formal leadership role. There's the young analyst who feels invisible in meetings, the mid-level manager overwhelmed by competing priorities, the talented team member struggling to influence without authority. Through these examples, Morgan, Lynch, and Lynch reveal a quiet truth. Leadership isn't a job title. It's a choice, repeated every day in small, often unseen moments. The metaphor of a spark is apt, and it's more than just a clever title. A spark doesn't wait for the perfect conditions. It simply exists, and when nurtured, it can become something powerful enough to warm, to light the way, or to change everything around it. Likewise, the authors argue that leadership starts the moment you stop waiting for someone else to fix the problem or define the path and instead ask, what can I do right now to move us forward? That mindset shift, simple on paper, feels almost radical in a work culture that often teaches us to stay in our lanes, defer to hierarchy, and wait for instructions. Reading Spark feels different from other books on leadership because it isn't built on abstract theory or idealized models. Instead, the authors draw from their backgrounds, including experience as military officers, to bring leadership down to earth, into the realm of daily practice rather than grand gestures. They talk candidly about moments when they struggle to live up to their own standards, when they fail to inspire, or when they let fear dictate silence instead of stepping forward. These stories make the authors feel less like distant experts and more like fellow travelers who've simply walked the path a bit longer. One of the central ideas that stayed with me is that you don't have to be perfect to lead. You simply have to choose again and again to act in alignment with your values and the needs of your team. That's a quietly liberating idea, especially for anyone who's held back from speaking up out of fear of getting it wrong. Leadership, in this view, isn't about certainty. It's about courage. And that courage often shows itself not in dramatic speeches or bold decisions, but in quieter moments. Asking the awkward question everyone's avoiding, volunteering to take on an unglamorous task, or offering support when a colleague stumbles. What makes this book particularly engaging is the warm, conversational style. You don't feel lectured to. You feel invited into a dialogue about what leadership really means and why it matters. And unlike some leadership books that feel geared exclusively toward executives or entrepreneurs, Spark speaks to anyone. The recent graduate, the team member in a flat organization, the seasoned professional who's quietly lost touch with why they once cared. The message is that leadership isn't about where you sit on the org chart. It's about how you show up. The authors introduce the concept of spark behaviors, specific choices and habits that cultivate influence and trust. But rather than presenting them as checkboxes, they weave them into stories and reflections that feel lived rather than imposed. For example, they talk about credibility not as an abstract virtue, but as something built through consistency and follow-through. Doing what you say you'll do, even in small matters, until people trust your word. They explore accountability, not just as holding others responsible, but as the willingness to own your mistakes and learn publicly, which paradoxically builds greater respect. There's also a strong emphasis on service. The idea that leadership is fundamentally about making things better for others rather than for yourself. This reframing is quietly transformative. It shifts the internal question from, how can I stand out? To, how can I help? And ironically, the authors show those who consistently look for ways to help often end up standing out anyway, not because they sought the spotlight, but because their contributions naturally draw others' respect. What I found deeply resonant is how the authors acknowledge the emotional dimension of leadership, the vulnerability, the self-doubt, the frustration of seeing a path forward when others don't. They write about how easy it is to become cynical when change feels slow or when your efforts aren't recognized. But they return, again and again, to the quiet discipline of showing up anyway. Leadership, they argue, isn't something you do once you feel confident. It's something you do in spite of discomfort and uncertainty. Over time, the act of choosing to lead shapes not only your environment but also your own sense of who you are. Throughout the book, the authors share stories of individuals who sparked change not by waiting for authority, but by stepping into responsibility where they saw a need. A junior employee who began coordinating across departments to fix a recurring issue. A mid-level manager who created informal mentoring circles after noticing younger colleagues felt adrift. These aren't fairy tales. They're grounded in messy, real workplaces where budgets are limited, politics are real, and results rarely happen overnight. And that makes them all the more inspiring. They remind us that leadership is accessible, even when the conditions aren't ideal. Another powerful idea the authors explore is that leadership is relational. Influence doesn't flow from charisma alone. It comes from building trust, understanding what matters to others, and aligning your actions with shared goals. They stress listening not as a performance but as a genuine effort to understand before acting. In a world where the loudest voice often dominates, there's something quietly radical about centering leadership on listening first. One of the most memorable sections for me was about the importance of self-leadership, the discipline of managing your own mindset, emotions, and habits before trying to guide others. The authors write candidly about the temptation to blame external circumstances when progress stalls and argue that real leaders look first at what they can change in themselves. This isn't about self-criticism. It's about reclaiming agency. It echoes an idea that runs like a thread through the book. The most significant change often starts within. The writing itself is warm, plain-spoken, and direct. The three voices blend seamlessly into a narrative that feels unified rather than fragmented. You get the sense of authors who care less about being quoted and more about being useful. There's humility here, an acknowledgement that leadership is a practice, not a perfected state. Even the authors, with their impressive resumes, admit they're still learning, still making mistakes, still trying to live up to the standards they teach. What I appreciate most is that Spark doesn't ask readers to transform overnight or become someone entirely different. Instead, it invites small, deliberate steps. Noticing where you can help, following through on commitments, speaking up when silence feels easier. These acts, repeated over time, become habits. And habits, the authors show, become reputation. The quiet authority that makes others naturally look to you in moments of uncertainty. As I read, I found myself thinking about times when I'd hesitated to act because I felt too junior, too new, or too unsure. The book gently challenges those excuses, not with scolding but with questions. What if leadership isn't about certainty but about willingness? What if influence is less about power and more about presence? And what if, in waiting to feel ready, we miss the very moments that could define us? By the time I finished the book, I didn't feel inspired to give a rousing speech or radically overhaul my work life. Instead, I felt a quieter resolve. To pay more attention, to listen with genuine curiosity, to follow through on the small promises that are easy to dismiss. And perhaps most importantly, to remember that the authority to lead isn't something we wait to be granted. It's something we choose to claim quietly and consistently through our actions. Reflecting now, Spark feels less like a blueprint and more like a companion. A set of conversations that return to you long after you've closed the cover. It doesn't pretend leadership is easy or glamorous. It acknowledges the frustrations, the resistance, the slow pace of change. But it also insists gently and persistently that your choice to lead, to spark change rather than wait for it, matters more than you realize. And maybe that's the deepest lesson. Leadership isn't something reserved for a lucky few born with charisma or given lofty titles. It's something quietly human, rooted in service, courage, and consistency. It lives in small moments. An encouraging word, a question asked with genuine interest, a promise kept. And while those moments may seem insignificant alone, together they become something larger. A spark that, with enough care and courage, can light the way for others too. In the end, what Spark offers isn't just advice. It's an invitation to stop waiting for perfect conditions, to see leadership not as something out there, but as something already within you, waiting to be practiced. And perhaps, after reading, you'll notice moments that once felt too small to matter now feel like opportunities to lead. Not someday, not when you're promoted, but right here, right now, exactly where you are.